We know that this crisis is affecting nonprofits in very different ways right now. For some, this has completely upended organizational business models. Others are seeing a tremendous growth in demand for services and are just trying to keep up. And we really don't even know what's happening in the weeks or months ahead. So today we were hoping by coming together, sharing some experiences from two leaders, that we could help you all with just some tactics and some capacities that we have found helpful in creating adaptive and resilient organizations. So we're going to try to keep the conversation focused on holding that balance between long-term vision and immediate needs. But really, we just want to answer the questions that you have most top of mind. So this is very much a conversation, and we'll be wanting you to bring your questions, and we'll be setting aside plenty of time for you to bring your questions. So a little bit of housekeeping on how to do that. Although by now I think we're all very familiar with this technology. In case you're new to Zoom, this is what we're doing. Since we have a lot of people on the line, your lines are muted. And we would invite you to communicate with us via the chat function, and you can see on your screen directions for how to do that. So again, if you need support during the call, you can feel free to chat us directly, and when we open it up for questions, you can chat that as well. Also, if your name isn't showing next to your box or your picture, if you could right-click on that and rename yourself, that way when questions and comments are coming in, we can tell who they're coming from. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to do that as well, that would be really helpful for the conversation. So I thought we could just take a moment to play around with the chat feature and everybody introduce yourselves. So if you would be so kind as to share your name, your organization that you're with, and maybe a word describing a feeling that you're bringing into the conversation today. So go ahead and chat those in, and you can open up the chat box to see who's on the call with you. And while we're doing that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today we have two leaders with us to share their experiences. First, I'll introduce Amy Salep. Amy is the CEO of Community Wealth Partners. She's been in that leadership role for more than 10 years and been at the firm for over 18 years in all. And she's located in the Washington, D.C. area. Amy, you want to say hello?
I have to come on off mute to do that. Hello, everyone. So glad you all joined us. Thank you.
And we also have with us Laura Meyers, who is the CEO of Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan, Washington. And Laura stepped into that role in 2008. Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
Great. And thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I'm seeing some good words, committed, resilient, flexible. These are all good feelings. So hopefully we can foster more of those in our time together today. So now I'm just going to dive right into the conversation and put it like this so we can see more faces. So Laura, I'm going to start with you. As I just said, you've been at the helm of Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C. for more than a decade. And during that time, you've led the organization from recovery from a recession, the 2016 presidential election, and now a global pandemic. As you look back, are there things from the prior year challenges that feel similar to what's happening now, and what feels different? And then also, what are some tactics that you and your team are using now to help manage through this time?
That's a lot. I'll say this, and I think I'm stating the obvious, that the magnitude of this crisis far exceeds anything any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. So acknowledging that reality and the intense anxiety throughout the world, certainly in our country, in our communities, on our staffs, there's a magnitude and a scope of that is different than past crises or past challenges. But there are some things that are the same in terms of the responses to that. And that is, in terms of how an organization responds. So rapidly shifting strategy is something we needed to do during the recession, needed to do after the 2016 election, because there were threats in terms of our ability to provide services, and then and now. So looking at, and I'm a fan of Apollo 13 movie, and at one point a character says, well, what's good on the ship, right? So sort of assessing what strengths does the organization have to bear on this particular crisis? What are the things we have to shore up? How do we laser focus on what's important in terms of our ability to deliver missions, so that are the absolutely we must do, need to have in order to do the must do's, and then looking at potentially how do we contract so that we can do that. So there are some things that are very similar. In terms of our organization, one of the things that we've done, throughout my tenure is really work with our board as thought partners. How do we work together to solve these problems? That it's not just up to the management or up to the board, but how do we work together to do that? And then, I would say the idea of communication, and two things about that. One, over communicating at every moment. So right now we are sending our staff daily updates. Our COVID task force meets daily. Our executive team meets daily so that we can plan and communicate between departments around what we need to do to focus in. So, I think that there are certain things that are similar, but this sense of over communication, being in touch, both internally and then externally to your stakeholders, your partners, your elected leaders that are your allies, and your supporters is very, very, I think, very critical. You asked what's different here, and besides scope, I think it's just the pace of this situation, how it's evolving so quickly and changing almost on a daily basis. And so the need for that interdepartmental or staff communication and sort of working the problem together becomes that much more critical. I would say the last thing I would say that is vastly different in this circumstance, of course, during the recession, people had job insecurity and anxiety around that. They also, in our organization after 2016, had concerns about the organization's ability to survive. But right now, we've got personal fear. Fear that people have for their own personal safety, the safety of their families. So it just ramps up that level of anxiety. And I think for leaders, the necessity for us to communicate to our staffs in acknowledging that reality, acknowledging that, and communicating very authentically about that.
Thank you. Laura, when you talked about what's good on our ship, that made me think about, just some of those like core capacities that you probably have been building over the years that are maybe helping you get through now. Can you speak to what's good on your ship and that, I guess, that other organizations might want for that resilience and adaptability?
Sure. So those of you who don't know us, we're the oldest and largest provider of family planning services in Washington, D.C. And so we've been around a very long time. And so I'll say this, because right after the 2016 election, I can remember our staff saying, are we going to be okay? And leaning on our history and the challenges we'd faced over time in this organization and how we've been able to draw on that sense of resiliency and strength. So one of the things very specifically that I've done over the last years has been, one, to really increase relationships with our stakeholders so that they are in communication about what we're doing and things that are exciting and then things that are really challenging. So bringing them in as partners as well. As I said, our board is a thought partner. And then we've really worked on our executive leadership. And we've devoted resources and time to really ensuring that that group of people are working well together in terms of communication, trust, respect, And that is obviously of great benefit to us now as we go into a crisis and really need to lean on each other and sometimes challenge each other to get to solutions to problems. So that's been very helpful as well.
Great, thank you. Amy, I want to bring you into the conversation. What from what Laura has shared resonates with what you've seen just working over the years with a variety of organizations? And particularly, what do you think are some of those critical factors that help organizations kind of cope through these hard times and stay resilient?
Sure. So a lot of what Laura just shared resonates. And so I may repeat a couple of things just to lift them up and reiterate them and then add a few. I think the first thing I would say is really staying focused on kind of what your true purpose is. It is very easy in this time when you need resources to run after the resources, but then kind of get yourself off course. And I think for the long term, that's not always the greatest thing to do. And so I think really being clear on what your true purpose is and what your mission is. I think the thing that does have to adapt and change, as you talked about, Laura, is how you get there. And for almost every organization right now, I feel like the how you get there, which is really the strategy, is needing to adapt and to change, particularly for those organizations that require kind of being, on a site or a location or in connection with others physically. That isn't obvious, but there are other ways too in which that has to change. I think the second thing that's really important is self-care. I mean, I wrote a blog about this because I'm really big on this, and it's not just care for yourself, it's care for your team. It's care for your other stakeholders who you engage with on a daily basis to do your work. It is very hard to show up and be present for other people as a leader or as a employee in a nonprofit if you are feeling like you can't show up, right? For whatever reason, because you're not taking care of what you need. So I think that's really, really critical. The third thing I mentioned, it's reiterating what Laura said, and we've done something very similar, and we've seen a lot of our clients do this too, and that is setting up a very intentional group of people and a very intentional structure through which you are communicating about the short-term needs and what needs to go on. And so, for us, we have an executive team meeting every other day, and that helps us deal with what's coming our way, make decisions, and communicate them out. I think sometimes for some organizations, it can be helpful to almost have two separate groups of people, those who are dealing with the short term, right, and the immediate front lines response, if you have some kind of frontline response that your organization is in charge of right now, and also having a group that maybe can think and do some of the planning for the longer term, which we'll get to in this conversation and what that looks like. I guess the last three things I'll mention really quickly is like confront dysfunction. There's no time for dysfunction. I mean, I find myself as a leader right now, I have no patience for it. I have no patience for long processes. I have no patience for serious dysfunction. And I think this is the moment, if you're a leader who maybe has let something go too long, this is the moment to confront it and stop it because there's no time for it. And then I think finally, the communicate's important. The over communicate, and we're going to talk more about finances in this call, I know, because a lot of you chatted in questions about finances, but I'll just say strong cash management and strong cash preservation. How do you preserve cash in a moment like this?
Thanks. And then Amy, what about the longer term? I mean, so, it's hard to imagine what things are going to look like a month from now. And so if an organization is trying to imagine its future even a year from now, what are some tools and approaches that you would recommend?
Sure. So I think this is going to sound really basic, but I just think the basics sometimes are what's needed and simple. And that is just some simple scenario planning. I think don't get yourself wrapped up in trying to implement a really complex process at this point. I would say kind of the 4 steps that I would recommend organizations think about, no matter kind of how this is impacting your organization, this can be useful. Number 1, gather the data you have, the financial data you have about your cash, right? The financial or the data you have about your constituents and what they need from you right now. Whatever data you have that will help you understand the situation, both from an organizational financial standpoint, but also perhaps from a programmatic standpoint. Gather a small group of your team. The second step and third step then is use that team to create stories about what the future may look like over that next 1 to 2 years. I know none of us know. I mean, I don't know. I don't have answers. None of us have answers about what this is really going to mean for the world, let alone for our organization. But I think begin to construct some of those stories. And then the key, and I think this is the most important part, is what are the actions you will take if that story starts to pan out, right? What are the actions you will take organizationally if it starts to really develop into one of those stories, or or to mitigate, if you will, the most significant impacts and risks.
Great, thank you. So Amy, I'm going to stay with you. The question we heard most when people were registering for the webinar was about concerns about financial sustainability. Are there anything you want to add to that point for nonprofits where this is top of mind? Like what can they be doing?
I think the most important point I would reiterate is to really, truly try to balance both responding to the financial uncertainty or devastation you might be experiencing, which might mean going out and having conversations to look for immediate emergency funds or things like that. Balance it with some planning so you don't get caught off guard, right? Because it's very easy to live in the moment and start grabbing for what's out there and not pay attention to what you might need to be doing 1 month, 2 months, 3 months from now. And so that's where the scenario planning, I think, becomes really important. So that if my cash dips below this is the action I'm going to need to take. Don't get so focused on just trying to bring in more cash and more money and forget to plan for what you're going to do if that cash and money doesn't come in, right? So I think it's really key to kind of balance both of those things. The other thing I would say is we often say that in our world that sustainability is not only about money. And I know right now money is what speaks, trust me, and cash is king, as we always say. But the reality is that part of figuring out the sustainability formula is also prioritization, getting rid of things that aren't very critical right now in terms of your programmatic work or other work that you're doing, making sure that what you are offering is relevant in this moment. So it is thinking more holistically than just thinking about the money, because the reality is a lot of organizations that we see in good times, not in times like this, in good times, they get themselves into sustainability issues because they're trying to do too much or they're trying to do everything, as opposed to being really focused on the one thing that they're best in the world at and uniquely positioned to deliver. So sometimes in these moments, you really have to think about narrowing in, prioritizing, shrinking in order to preserve your sustainability.
Thank you. Laura, what would you say to funders on the call about what they can do to help their grantees with their financial sustainability right now?
A couple of things come to mind. I think that the first thing is reducing the administrative burden. How can you streamline your processes so that those application processes are more streamlined and less burdensome? How you can potentially provide technical assistance or fund technical assistance if that's financial modeling or things like strategy. How can the funders fund that for nonprofits that may not have that internal capacity? I think focusing on general operating support, moving away from restricted program fundraising to general operating support, because that's so very needed. And I think the last thing I would say is free up some more dollars. The rainy day is now. It's pouring.
Thank you. We're seeing a lot of foundations are doing that, which is great. So I have one more question for Laura and Amy, and I want to invite everybody else on the call to start thinking about your questions, and you can go ahead and chat them in. But I'll go ahead with a closing question from me, and I'm going to ask you guys to look for the silver lining. So I found the Albert Einstein quote, "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity." Laura, I'll ask you first. Have you seen this ring true for your organization yet? And if so, how?
I have. One of the silver, it's not a silver lining, but one of the positive things is that because our teams are communicating daily and working so closely together, those kind of, silos are breaking down. I don't know if others experience this, where one department really doesn't know what the value of the other department. What are those people over there doing? Never everybody knows what everybody's doing. And so there is this sort of ancillary benefit to that people are really recognizing their interdependence between departments, and how really it's all of us pulling together that's actually going to help us make it through all of this. So this sort of core d'esprit, really coming to fruition. The other thing is the need for rapid innovation. And some of the projects in terms of innovation that we said, well, we'll get to that further down the road, we're doing it now. So something that we said, well, we really need to do this because this is part of our future. In particular, healthcare, you can imagine healthcare has changed as technology has become more advanced. And so something, for example, like telehealth for our primary care service, we were originally going to do in June because that's when, we sort of put it on our work plan due to capacity issues. We went live on primary care on telehealth on Sunday. So necessity being the mother of not only invention, but also the pace of innovation.
Great, thank you. And Amy, what would you say on that? How might leaders find opportunity right now in these difficult times? What recommendations would you have?
It's funny. So listening to you, Laura, there were two things I was going to say, and you actually touched on them both. And it's great. It was around culture, and it was also around kind of the opportunity to innovate or experiment, because it's almost a necessity for so many. But I would say on the culture, I recently heard an executive director of another organization say, we were having a lot of cultural challenges prior to this, and now I feel like we should be starting our culture work because there's so much good coming out of our teams working together, that this is an opportunity to sit back and say, why is it, what is it that we're doing right now that's really positive that we want to keep? And let's be really intentional and reflective about it. I know there's not a lot of time to reflect, but I thought her comment was great, in that she was realizing that good things were coming out of it, and she didn't want to lose that, and wanted people to be aware of how their behavior maybe had shifted in this moment so that they could keep it going. So I just think that's an interesting one. I will also say we are seeing organizations have opportunities to experiment, and that is just simply because they've had to. Whether it's creation of an app, right, as we're seeing Share of Strength, right, a new app that will help people understand where they can get meals right now. So it's technology-based, new distribution models for services of all kinds. So whether it's health services, food services, you name it, recreational services, right? Like everything. Folks are figuring out kind of those new distribution models. And so I would encourage folks, if there is an opportunity kind of within your mission area, start small, try the experiment, right? For those who don't maybe have a lot of resources, it doesn't have to be a big experiment. It can be also a small experiment. And really try to focus in on what you want to learn from that experiment, so you come out the other end kind of stronger and better in knowing how you might be able to carry it forward.
Great, thank you. Well, we're starting to get some questions in, and again, feel free to chat those in, but I'll go ahead and ask. The first one is for you, Amy. You had mentioned prioritizing and kind of sticking with the essentials. And the question is, how do you do that well without furloughing staff who are dependent on their work?
I'm sorry, Lori, can you say?
How do you prioritize? Is there a way to do it without having to furlough staff who are dependent on their work, was the question.
So how do you prioritize without furloughing staff?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding the question. So I think that, there's got to be a question about, your ability to hold on to those staff over the long term, right? Like you've got to face the financial reality of that. So I think prioritize, right? Direct as many staff resources as you need to that priority. And if there are folks that don't have things to do because their work, and we've seen this in a lot of organizations, right, where their work has kind of dried up because of what's going on and they don't have a lot to do, that I think you have to do the scenario planning to know, can you hold on to them? And at what point will you have to make the hard decision that you can't hold on to them, right? What will your financials look like? And what are your options, right? Obviously, through some of the stimulus package and even the Families First Coronavirus Act that came before the stimulus package, there are some options available to nonprofits and to organizations to think about how they bridge, right, their funding or their resources or their cash essentially in order to get through so that they maybe don't have to furlough staff as much. But I think you've got to be honest with yourself as to whether or not that work is going to come back, right? If that work is not going to come back and you don't have the resources to support it, I think you've just, I hate to say this, but you have to be honest with yourself, right? If you feel like it's going to come back and it's just a matter of time, then I think try to figure out if you can access some of those bridge opportunities.
I also, if I could just jump in too, I think, that we're in a generative moment, right? And so in terms of not just thinking about strategy, and I think, Amy, you're pointing this out, that this is about, if our entire world has changed, what is our place in that world? And what is a fundamental value that we bring to that and to our communities? And I think, I think that's really, I think you have to focus on what's my financial situation, and then what's my place in the world? And those are two tough questions, but I think that's something that, I think leaders and boards have to grapple with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't say this earlier when I said scenario planning, and I don't say this lightly, but I feel like we also have to do ourselves the service when we're doing scenario planning to play out that very, very worst case scenario.
Yeah.
You just have to. You will be better prepared to deal with it when it hits and to treat people right if you plan for it now.
I don't know if anyone read in the Washington Post today, it was a great article about a guy who was in Fallujah, and he talked about his commander giving them the honest assessment, the straight up facts. And I think, in terms of conversations with, the executive senior leadership and the board, we have to be talking about what are acceptable losses in terms of a financial picture, and then what is that worst case scenario, and then what would we do in that worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Great. Laura, a question for you that came in advance is about caring for the staff. I mean, so you named like just the anxieties that everyone is feeling. We're all exhausted too, right? Trying to figure out how to do our jobs from home, and some of us have children at home, and there's no boundaries, as you said. And also for many nonprofit workers, this work is needed now more than ever. So as a leader, like how can leaders care for their teams? What advice do you have?
I think some of those are short term, some of those are longer term. And I think short term, acknowledging the reality for people. I think some of the things in terms of logistics, one of the things, for example, we're trying to figure out is, what about childcare? What are the resources in the community for our staff for childcare? What about transportation? How will they get to work if there's a lockdown on public transportation, or they don't have access to cars, et cetera? So how do we work out some of the logistics for staff? I think being honest and authentic about what's happening, what do they need, being responsive to those things to the extent that you can. I think encouraging self-care. One of the things that we've done is changed our leave policies. So for example, new employees that may not have accrued certain leave, we've front-loaded leave on individual basis so that if someone is caring for somebody who is sick, and I don't mean necessarily COVID-related sick, or is not feeling well themselves, they can stay home. So whether that's policies, acknowledging reality, or whether it's thinking through what are some of the challenges employees might be facing, I think a combination thereof.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Amy, anything you'd want to add on that question?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything Laura said. The only thing I'd add is just, I think it helps staff sometimes to just acknowledge that this is not business as usual. I had somebody write to me the other day and say, I have a friend who is really struggling because their employer is acting like this is just business as usual and you just need to keep getting your work done. That only creates more anxiety for people. And trust me, it's going to have the opposite effect. They're not going to be getting their work done because there's so much emotion then that comes into play. And there's already emotion in all of this. So I think that just being real and telling people we get this is not business as usual. And, we said to our staff, like, we don't care if your kids are in your videos. You might see my kids walk in here in a minute. Like, we don't care if your cats and dogs, like, we don't want you to feel like you have to be all buttoned up right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Another question just came in about mergers. So yeah, the timing isn't maybe isn't right for right now, but Amy, what do you think about like how to think about mergers as a scenario option? Do you have advice on that?
I think it is an option for organizations. So in 2008, we did see some shrinkage in the nonprofit sector as a result of that recession. And I would hypothesize that we will see just as much, if not more, this time around. I know La Piana just released some results of a survey that did show that a lot of organizations already are significantly laying off staff and furloughing staff, et cetera. And so that starts to make you wonder and think about what does that mean for those organizations overall. What I would say is think about sustainability. If you're in that situation where you feel like you might have to confront that, say try to really think about sustainability as sustaining your impact or your mission, and think about, is the best opportunity for you to do that maybe by joining forces with somebody else, right? As opposed to feeling like you need to continue to float on your own. Trust me, that is not an easy question to answer. And I recognize that. But I think sometimes for the good of the mission and of the work, there can be opportunities there.
Great, thank you. We got a question related to organizational culture that I'd love both of you to speak to because you both have kind of touched on it, on the importance of that. Just acknowledging that so many of us are all working from home. What advice do you have for being intentional about organizational culture right now if the staff can't physically be together? Amy, do you want to go first? And then Laura.
Sure. Well, I'll just share with you a lot of the different things that I've seen or that we're trying. It's like for every organization, some of these things might be relevant, some not. I have seen an executive director say that he spends 10 minutes every week having a one-on-one video chat with every single one of his 40 staff right now, just in order to kind of check in and see how they're doing. I have seen things where, folks are creating kind of fun virtual opportunities. We're doing a lot of this, right? We have virtual snack times, virtual lunches. I noticed that some of the folks on our kind of people team are now adding lots of fun elements to those virtual lunches. Bring your favorite pet or stuffed animal. I mean, I'm saying this, but I think the point of it is to bring a little bit of joy in people's lives and some fun at a time that doesn't always feel very joyful or very fun. And so I think that those things become really key. The other thing I think, and this goes back to kind of communication, but just from a leadership standpoint too, is, how you communicate reinforces culture. How accessible you make yourself as a leader, whether you're the CEO or some other kind of manager or leader, is just to really work hard to create forums. We have on agenda meetings, right? Which is like, there's no agenda. It's just a time in which people know that I'm sitting there. We're now doing them with our entire executive team where you can just know people can come with questions. So I think just creating very intentional opportunities, some to just get people's basic questions answered and keep connection, but also some that are fun, right? And that allow people to just connect on a personal level about the funny things that are happening in their lives. Like, you know, there are some of those happening too in this moment of us all being virtual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I would say, you know, there is some of that. We're a little bit different. We're a healthcare provider. We have staff that are worried about personal protective equipment and their own personal safety. So we have to really balance that sort of playfulness with the somberness of people in health centers. And, you know, we've done limited testing in our primary care practice for COVID. So we cannot minimize the seriousness of that. And so, but that's a tricky balance, right? And however, every night on Monday mornings, we have all staff calls so that we cover some of the key things in terms of our medical practice and how we've adjusted protocols to allow for social distancing in the health centers to protect safety and the safety of staff and our patients. So we focus on those critical issues. We're not there yet in terms of striking that balance with how do we be playful in a moment when some of our staff are teleworking, all of our non-clinical staff are teleworking, and then our clinical staff are in health centers delivering patient care.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that we got, Amy, you wrote in that SelfCare blog that you referenced, and Lori provided a link in the chat. You know, it's important to think about organizational self-care right now too, right? That part of us being able to continue to serve our communities for the long haul means we need to invest in our organizations. At the same time, you know, many leaders are feeling like we're having to be really conservative and hedge our bets and risk averse. And so the question is just looking for advice on like balancing that, weighing the pros and cons of like investing in yourself versus, you know, not spending too much money, I guess. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, part of investing yourself is just investing in the care of your people, and care doesn't have to come through money. Care can come, and granted, time is money in some settings. I get that, but just small things that you can do to show people that you care, right? Reaching out, asking how they're doing, etc. I think in terms of the broader organizational care, I think part of that is, if there's ever a moment, if you've ever been somebody who's afraid to speak up to a funder about what you need, this is the moment. This is the moment to be bold and brave. You've got nothing to lose. And so when your stakeholders and your funders are having conversations with you, or if they haven't reached out, for you to reach out and tell them what you really need. And be really explicit and clear about that, not only in terms of what it's for and why, but how much money you really need to make it happen. I'm not saying that all those things are going to be produced and answered, but I just think it is a moment to be bold with those that, and even individual donors, and being really clear and explicit about what you need so that you can continue to either operate and meet short-term needs, or whether it's about what you need so that as things slow down with this pandemic, you're still there to meet the needs that you were meeting before, that probably are going to still be there, right? For many organizations.
You know, I think back to 2008 during the recession, going to we called them our angel donors. So they were our large, close-in donors, and talking about not just immediate survival and the immediate situation, but how we were investing in and transforming the organization to meet the needs in the future as healthcare was rapidly changing.
Mm-hmm. And Laura, I was going to ask you, like at that time, as you were kind of rebuilding the organization after the recession, what were the priority investments in capacity that you made that made the biggest difference?
Certainly technological infrastructure, facilities infrastructure, so that we upgraded all of our health centers. Again, really thinking through in terms of what is the data in our region saying about where we should locate health centers depending on community needs. So for example, our health center in Prince George's, we located that in what's called a medically underserved area, a doctor desert, because that community needed services. So utilizing the data that you have or can get to make decisions about where are the community needs, how you will respond to them. And so we've contracted very significantly during that period of time so that we were well positioned for growth. So looking at facilities, technology, studying our communities in terms of needs.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left to take questions. So I just want to put a call out if people want to chat in any final questions. And in the meantime, we did get a question about advice for creating contingency plans. And Amy, I know you've kind of spoken about scenario planning at a high level, but I was just wondering, are there any like nuts and bolts advice about contingency plans that you would offer, or how to know, like how people might know, like, you know, what levers to pull when?
Mm-hmm. So every organization is so different. So I'm trying to think about what those nuts and bolts are without being so generic that it's not useful. I mean, I think the key in all of that is, like I said, confronting the hard truth about what those actions are that you might have to take in those different scenarios, being really clear. And quite frankly, this is a moment in which your team and staff are seeing people get laid off. They're seeing people get furloughed. If that is a scenario that your organization is facing in terms of, you look at, you know, your worst case and you're like, that's what we're going to have to do. I'm not saying you have to say all of that now, but I do think that it's important to be honest with people about the fact that that is a potential scenario. It is not what you're telling them about what you're doing to try to not have that scenario, and that you're doing everything in your power and you're being creative, but that it's something you may have to consider at some point. I realize that different people have different philosophies about that. My philosophy is that it's already on everybody's minds. So you just need to say it out loud if it's a real potential scenario. And in terms of other contingencies, like I said, I think, you know, cash is king in this moment. So figuring out what those, like, this is not the time to invest in something that maybe was in the plans, but isn't really needed right now, right? Maybe it's a new staff position. Maybe it's like, I would say right now is the time to really, really be disciplined about your cash and your resources, so that that to me is going to be your biggest friend in terms of creating flexibility as you move forward.
Thanks. We got a question from a donor who is just receiving a lot of relief donation requests. And I can imagine on a donor perspective that the amount of need is overwhelming as well. So do you have advice for like how a donor might manage these different requests? The question is, you know, is it appropriate to ask for more information? I think that, you know, I'm reading from there some intent about being mindful about not putting more burden on the nonprofit. So yeah, maybe both of you could chime in. What advice might you have for the donor who's feeling a little flooded with requests?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, you know, and I feel this way about fundraising in general, nonprofits allow donors to achieve their own mission, you know, and to realize their own values. So, you know, it's prioritizing your values around what you want to accomplish in your community. So I would say there, you know, being clear about what your own values are. And then I think it is appropriate to ask for some more information. You know, I would, of course, balance that with, please don't ask for the last 10 years of financials and, you know, the financial projections for 7 different scenarios. You know, if you can keep that succinct and brief about what they're going to spend the money on, what their financial projections are, I think that's a reasonable request, because that's where, you know, that's the nonprofit's responsibility is to communicate to stakeholders about what the situation is in realistic terms and what they need and how that request will fit into long-term sustainability and surviving the moment.
Great. Amy, anything you would want to add?
Agreed. I would just say maybe the question to ask yourself is, what information do I really, really need? And is it going to change my decision about giving the money?
Yeah.
To help you prioritize what you ask for.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I think I'm going to ask you guys maybe to each share some closing thoughts. So do you, maybe some final words of advice for the leaders that are on the line today? Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say one, Amy alluded to this earlier, and that's the concept of taking care of yourself and your teams so that you are resilient for the long haul. This is not a short-term crisis. This is going to require us to be very resilient as we go and highly adaptable. And it's hard to be adaptable and flexible and emotionally consistent if you're not taking care of yourself so that you can be resilient for your team, for your organization.
Thank you, Laura. And Amy?
Give yourself a break, kind of to follow up on that, meaning we're all moving very fast and making decisions we've never made before. So be okay with the fact that we are all beautifully imperfect and we're going to make lots of mistakes, and others that are around us are going to make lots of mistakes. So how do you give the benefit of the doubt, extend grace? I think that's one. And then I think the second thing is, just to be real with each other, but also try to give hope where you can, right? I feel like no matter what position you are in an organization, we all have an opportunity to influence our peers, those that we manage, anywhere in an organization. And I feel like this is a moment to be really real with people, right? About what's going on, about the facts, about how we're feeling, right? Maybe why we couldn't act the way that we had hoped to act in a particular moment, right? But also to try to give hope to each other. I mean, I feel like the human spirit is amazingly resilient, and I feel like the more we can boost each other up and give hope, the better off we'll all be.
I would also say that don't lose sight of your dream. So like your vision, keep that, on the horizon, because even though this is not a short-term crisis, there eventually we'll get a grip on this. And I think the other thing that I think about is it's okay to say I don't know. It's okay to say this is uncertainty and I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but we're going to figure it out together.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you everyone on the line for joining this conversation. It's great to have you. We wanted to share a few resources in wrap up. We'll be sending an email with links to these as well. But we do have some resources that we thought were relevant to the times. We also have some upcoming webinars similar to this on some specific topics that coming up in April and June. Also, if you could click on that link for the 4-question survey when you can, that would be really helpful just to get feedback on this, but also if there's other questions top of mind that we can be helpful in creating content or conversation or connection, we want to do that. And so there's space in that survey for you to share, how else might more support help you during this time.
Can I make one other comment, Lori, about that?
Yes.
Just from the Community Wealth Partners standpoint, we are here right now to be thought partners to anybody who wants just some free thought partnership. And so what we would say is that you'll see a link to that on our site related to COVID-19. But you'll see that the person whose name is listed there is Lori Bartsack, that you can reach out to Lori and say, hey, I'd love to have a conversation with one of the consultants. So just for folks to know that we're here and happy to have a conversation if you just need to think through something.
Amy, ditto, if anyone wants to reach out to me, The folks at Community Wealth Partners, who have been enormously helpful to us over the years, have my contact information. Happy to be a resource.
Thank you. That's so kind. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Hang in there.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming.